Sarah Mitchell, age 7, disappeared on a humid afternoon in June 1993 from the small town of Oak Ridge, Texas. She had been playing in her front yard, her mother watching from the kitchen window while preparing dinner. In the span of 5 minutes, the time it took to answer a phone call, Sarah vanished without a trace. The afternoon had been ordinary in every way. Sarah wore her favorite yellow sundress with white flowers, her brown hair pulled into pigtails with matching yellow ribbons. She had been drawing on the sidewalk with chalk, creating elaborate hopscotch patterns and rainbow butterflies. Her older brother, Marcus, was at soccer practice. Her father wouldn't be home from work for another 2 hours. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday. When Linda Mitchell returned to the window, the sidewalk was empty. The chalk lay abandoned. A blue piece rolled into the gutter. Sarah's bicycle remained propped against the oak tree where she'd left it. The front gate swung gently in the breeze, though Linda couldn't remember if it had been open before. She called Sarah's name, stepping onto the porch. Her voice echoed down the quiet street lined with modest ranch-style homes. Neighbors' sprinklers hissed rhythmically. A dog barked in the distance. Everything seemed normal, yet everything was wrong. Linda walked to the sidewalk, calling louder now. She checked the backyard, the garage, the small shed where they kept garden tools. She ran to the neighbor's house, then the next one, her panic rising with each empty response. By the time she dialed 911, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. The Oak Ridge Police Department responded within minutes. Chief Robert Harrison arrived personally, a man who had lived in the town for 40 years and knew every family. He organized an immediate search. Officers went door to door. Volunteers gathered within the hour, forming search parties that combed through the residential streets, the nearby park, the wooded area behind the elementary school. By nightfall, over 300 people were searching. They called Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like fireflies. The local radio station broadcast her description every 15 minutes. Neighbors brought coffee and sandwiches to the Mitchell home, where Linda sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at Sarah's empty chair. The first 48 hours were crucial, investigators knew. They interviewed everyone on the street. Had anyone seen a strange car, an unfamiliar person? Everyone remembered the afternoon as completely ordinary. Mrs. Patterson had been watering her roses. Mr. Chen had been mowing his lawn. The Rodriguez kids had been riding bikes at the end of the street. No one had noticed anything unusual. No one except Tommy Brennan, age 12, who lived 4 houses down. Tommy told police he'd seen a blue sedan driving slowly past the Mitchell house twice that afternoon. He remembered because the car had stopped briefly and the driver seemed to be looking at something. But Tommy couldn't describe the driver. He'd been too far away. The sedan was older, maybe from the 80s, with some rust on the back fender. Police issued an alert for the vehicle. They checked registration records for every blue sedan in Oak Ridge and the surrounding counties. They found 47 possible matches and investigated each one. Every owner had an alibi or no connection to the case. Days turned into weeks. The story made regional news, then national headlines. Sarah's picture appeared on milk cartons and grocery store bulletin boards. The FBI sent agents to assist. Psychics called with visions. Tips flooded in from across the state. Someone had seen a girl matching Sarah's description at a rest stop near Houston, at a diner in El Paso, at a shopping mall in Dallas. Every lead was investigated. Every lead went nowhere. Linda and her husband David appeared on television, pleading for Sarah's return. Linda held Sarah's favorite stuffed rabbit, a worn brown bunny named Coco. She could barely speak through her tears. David, a quiet man who worked as an accountant, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Their son Marcus, only 11, stopped going to school. He blamed himself for being at soccer practice, though there was nothing he could have done. The investigation consumed Oak Ridge. The town had never experienced anything like this. Crime was rare, mostly traffic violations and the occasional theft. Children had always played freely in yards and streets. Parents had never worried. Now, suddenly, everyone was afraid. Kids were kept inside. Playdates were supervised. The innocence of the small town shattered. Investigators developed theories. Perhaps Sarah had wandered off and gotten lost. Search teams with tracking dogs covered miles of surrounding terrain, fields, woods, creek beds. They found nothing. Perhaps she'd been abducted by someone passing through town. But Oak Ridge was off the main highway, not a place people drove through by accident. Perhaps someone local was involved, someone trusted. Background checks were run on teachers, coaches, family, friends, neighbors. Nothing suspicious emerged. Months passed. The FBI agents returned to other cases. Volunteers resumed their normal lives. The Mitchells' living room, once filled with investigators and support, grew quiet. The phone stopped ringing with tips. Television crews packed up their equipment. The story faded from the news. But Detective Maria Gonzalez refused to let it go. A 38-year-old investigator who had transferred to Oak Ridge from Austin 2 years before Sarah's disappearance, Maria had worked dozens of missing persons cases. None had affected her like this one. She had a daughter Sarah's age. She couldn't imagine the nightmare the Mitchells were living. Maria kept the case file on her desk. She reviewed it during lunch breaks, stayed late rereading witness statements, studying the timeline. She drove through the neighborhood, parking where the blue sedan had reportedly been seen, trying to understand what the driver might have been looking for. The case went cold officially after a year, but Maria continued working it quietly. She maintained contact with the Mitchells, calling every few weeks with updates, even when there were none. She wanted them to know someone still cared, someone was still looking. Years passed. 1994, 1995, 1996. The Mitchells stayed in Oak Ridge, unable to leave the house where Sarah had last been seen. What if she came home and they weren't there? Linda kept Sarah's room exactly as it had been, the bed made, toys arranged on shelves, yellow ribbons still hanging from the mirror. Every birthday, every Christmas, they set a place for her at the table. Marcus grew up carrying the weight of his sister's absence. He graduated high school, went to college, became a teacher. He chose to stay in Texas, unable to move too far from the last place Sarah had been seen. The case had defined his life, shaped every decision he made. Detective Gonzalez watched her own daughter grow from 7 to 14 to 20. At each milestone, she thought of Sarah, thought of what she might have become. The case haunted her dreams. She had failed this family, failed this child. The feeling never left her thoughts. In 2003, 10 years after Sarah's disappearance, Oak Ridge held a memorial service. The town gathered in the park where search parties had assembled a decade earlier. They planted a dogwood tree in Sarah's memory, installed a bench with a plaque bearing her name. Linda and David attended, their faces etched with permanent grief. They spoke briefly, thanking the community for never forgetting their daughter. Maria stood at the back of the crowd, watching. She had never stopped working the case, though officially it was buried under newer investigations. She had boxes of files in her garage, copies of everything from the original investigation. She studied them on weekends, looking for patterns she might have missed, connections that hadn't been obvious years earlier. The blue sedan bothered her. It was the only concrete detail from that day, yet it had led nowhere. Tommy Brennan's description had been vague, understandably so, given his age and the distance. But someone had been driving that car. Someone had been on that street. Maria had always believed the abduction was opportunistic, a predator who happened to be in the right place when Sarah was briefly alone. Technology had advanced since 1993. DNA testing had improved dramatically. Databases had expanded. Criminal profiling had become more sophisticated. Surveillance systems that hadn't existed in small towns were now commonplace. Maria began re-examining physical evidence that had been collected, fibers from Sarah's clothing that had been found near the sidewalk, unidentified fingerprints from the gate that had been left swinging open. The evidence had been stored carefully, cataloged and preserved according to protocols that investigators in 1993 hoped would someday yield answers. Maria requested everything be brought out of storage. She spread the items across a table in the evidence room, photographing each piece, documenting chain of custody, ensuring nothing would be compromised. There were photos of the scene, dozens of them, the sidewalk with its chalk drawings, the open gate, the bicycle against the tree, Sarah's shoes, small white sandals she'd kicked off while drawing, a hair ribbon that had fallen near the curb, fingerprint cards from the gate and surrounding areas, fiber samples collected from Sarah's room for comparison, soil samples from the yard and street. In 2008, 15 years after the disappearance, Maria attended a conference on cold case investigations in Dallas. She listened to presentations about new forensic techniques, advances in DNA analysis, novel approaches to interviewing witnesses decades after crimes occurred. One presentation caught her attention, a case from California where investigators had used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in a 40-year-old case. The technique was revolutionary. Instead of relying solely on criminal DNA databases, investigators could upload DNA profiles to public genealogy websites where millions of people had submitted their genetic information to find relatives. By identifying distant cousins and building family trees, investigators could narrow down suspects to a specific person. Maria returned to Oak Ridge with renewed energy. She pulled every piece of physical evidence from storage again, this time sending samples to a private lab in Houston that specialized in genetic analysis. The lab had equipment and expertise that didn't exist in 1993. They could extract DNA from smaller samples, from degraded material, from evidence that earlier tests had deemed insufficient. The lab extracted DNA from skin cells found on the gate, cells that hadn't belonged to the Mitchell family or any of their frequent visitors. The cells had been there, preserved in evidence bags for 15 years, waiting for technology to catch up. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. No match. Maria wasn't surprised. She'd checked CODIS multiple times over the years with the same result. But now she had another option. She submitted the profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people uploaded their DNA results to find relatives. Weeks passed, then months. The genealogy search ran continuously, comparing the unknown DNA profile against millions of entries. Maria checked the results every day, hoping for a notification that would change everything. In March 2009, she received an alert. The DNA had matched with a third cousin of the unknown person who had touched the gate. It wasn't a close enough match to identify the person directly, but it was a starting point. Maria hired a genetic genealogist, a specialist who could build family trees from DNA matches. The genealogist was a woman named Patricia Chen, based in California, who had worked on several high-profile cold cases. She began building a family tree, working backward from the third cousin through generations of ancestors, then forward through different branches, identifying everyone who could be a potential match. The process was painstaking. Birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, census data, every document had to be tracked down and verified. The family tree grew to include hundreds of people spread across multiple states. Patricia worked methodically, eliminating branches that didn't fit, following promising leads, cross-referencing databases. The genealogist narrowed the pool based on age, gender, and geographic location. Who would have been in their 20s to 40s in 1993? Who had connections to Texas? Who had the physical capability to commit such a crime? The list shortened from hundreds to dozens to a handful of names. After 6 months of research, Patricia identified a prime candidate, James Rowland. Born in 1962 in Lubbock, Texas, he would have been 31 years old in 1993. He had lived in Texas his entire life, moving between small towns in the central part of the state, working construction jobs. He had no criminal record, no arrests, nothing that would have flagged him in the original investigation. Maria's heart raced as she read the report Patricia sent. She immediately began running background checks, pulling employment records, tracking James Rowland's movements over the past 30 years. She worked carefully, not wanting to alert him that he was being investigated. She needed to build an airtight case. She discovered Rowland had worked for several construction companies over the years, never staying with one employer for more than a few years. He moved frequently, living in Austin, then San Antonio, then smaller towns like Lockhart and Georgetown. He had been married briefly in the late 80s, divorced in 1991. No children, few friends. A solitary life that raised no suspicions but offered no alibis either. Maria requested employment records from every company Rowland had worked for. Many businesses had closed. Others had moved or been sold. Tracking down records from 1993 proved difficult. She contacted the Texas Workforce Commission, the state's employment security agency, which maintained records of employers and employees for tax purposes. Finally, she located records from Southwest Roofing and Construction, a company based in Austin that had gone out of business in 1998. The owner had retired to Arizona but still had boxes of old paperwork in his garage. He shipped them to Maria, dusty folders filled with job assignments, payroll records, and work orders from the 90s. Maria spread the documents across her desk, going through them page by page. She traced through job assignments for June 1993, looking for anything in or near Oak Ridge. Her finger stopped on an entry dated June 8, 1993, the day before Sarah disappeared. James Rowland had been assigned to a roofing job in Oak Ridge, repairing hail damage on a house on Maple Street. Maple Street was 3 blocks from where Sarah had lived. Maria felt electricity run through her body. The connection was there. Rowland had been in Oak Ridge the day before Sarah vanished. He would have driven through the neighborhood, scouted the area, seen the houses and families. He would have noticed a little girl playing in her front yard. The job assignment indicated work was scheduled for multiple days, June 8 through June 12. Sarah disappeared on June 9. Rowland would have been working in Oak Ridge that exact day. Maria contacted the homeowner on Maple Street, an elderly couple who still lived in the same house. Yes, they remembered having roof work done in 1993 after a hailstorm. Did they remember the workers? Not specifically, it had been so long ago. Did they keep any paperwork? They searched their files and found an invoice from Southwest Roofing, dated June 1993, with a crew list. James Rowland's name was on it. Maria now had physical evidence placing Rowland in Oak Ridge on the day of the abduction. She had DNA evidence placing him at the crime scene, but she needed more. She needed to confirm the DNA absolutely, needed to interview him, needed to find out what happened to Sarah. She located Roland's current address. He was living in a small apartment in San Marcos, about an hour south of Austin. He worked maintenance at a large apartment complex, fixing air conditioners, repairing plumbing, doing odd jobs. His supervisor described him as quiet, reliable, kept to himself. Tenants barely noticed him. Maria coordinated with San Marcos police. They needed to approach this carefully. Roland had evaded detection for 16 years. One mistake could spook him, could destroy the case. Maria obtained a warrant for a DNA sample based on the genealogical evidence and his presence in Oak Ridge on the day of the abduction. On a Wednesday morning in October 2009, officers approached Roland at his workplace. He was 57 years old now, graying, heavyset, unremarkable. He wore a maintenance uniform, carried a toolbox, looked like 1,000 other men in Texas. When officers identified themselves and asked him to come to the station, he complied without resistance. He seemed confused, cooperative. He had no idea why police wanted to talk to him. At the station, officers explained they were investigating an old case and needed a DNA sample to eliminate him as a suspect. Roland agreed, swabbing the inside of his cheek with a cotton applicator. He still seemed puzzled, asking what case they were investigating. Officers were vague, thanking him for his cooperation, letting him leave. The sample was rushed to the lab. Maria waited, barely sleeping, barely eating. She had devoted 16 years to this case. Sarah would have been 23 years old now, maybe graduated from college, maybe starting a career, maybe in love. All the possibilities stolen by whoever had taken her from that sidewalk. 3 days later, the results came back. The DNA from the gate matched James Roland with a probability exceeding 99.9%. It was him. After 16 years, Maria had found Sarah's abductor. Maria drove to San Marcos herself. She wanted to look him in the eyes, this man who had stolen Sarah Mitchell, who had destroyed a family, who had haunted her for over a decade. She brought 2 other investigators, prepared questions, planned her approach. This interrogation would determine everything. The interrogation room was small and windowless, painted beige, furnished with a metal table and uncomfortable chairs. James Roland sat across from Maria, his hands folded on the table. He looked nervous now, uncertain. A detective from Oak Ridge wouldn't drive to San Marcos for a routine elimination interview. Maria laid a photograph on the table. Sarah Mitchell, age 7, in her yellow sundress, smiling at the camera. The photo had been taken 2 weeks before she disappeared at her school's spring concert. She looked happy, innocent, full of life. Roland glanced at the photograph. His expression changed, something flickering in his eyes. Recognition, fear, guilt. Maria watched carefully, reading his body language, nodding every micro-expression. "Do you recognize this girl?" Maria asked, her voice calm, professional. "No," Roland said. His voice was quiet, uncertain. "Should I?" "Her name is Sarah Mitchell. She disappeared from Oak Ridge on June 9, 1993. You were working in Oak Ridge that day, 3 blocks from her house." Roland's face paled. He shifted in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I worked a lot of places," he said. "I don't remember every job." "Your DNA was found at her house," Maria continued. "On the gate to her front yard, the day she disappeared. Can you explain that?" Roland sat back. His breathing quickened. He looked at the photograph again, then at Maria, then at the 2-way mirror on the wall where he knew others were watching. "I want a lawyer," he said quietly. Maria had expected this. She had enough for an arrest. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. His presence in Oak Ridge on the day of the abduction was documented. But she wanted more. She wanted to know what happened to Sarah, where she was, if there was any chance, any possibility, that closure could be brought to the Mitchells after all these years. James Rowland was arrested and charged with kidnapping. News spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Television stations sent reporters. The Mitchell family, who had lived with uncertainty for 16 years, received a call from Maria late that evening. Linda answered the phone. She listened as Maria explained they had arrested someone, that DNA evidence linked him to Sarah's disappearance, that after 16 years they finally had answers. Linda collapsed in David's arms, sobbing, relief and grief and anger, everything she'd held inside for so long pouring out at once. The story made national headlines again. The small town that had never forgotten now watched as the case they'd mourned for 16 years finally moved toward resolution. But resolution wasn't the same as healing. Sarah was still missing. The most important question remained unanswered. Rowland's lawyer was a public defender named Michael Torres, a young attorney who handled mostly minor cases. This would be his highest-profile case. He met with Rowland for hours, reviewing evidence, discussing options. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. The circumstantial evidence was strong. They had almost no defense. Torres negotiated with prosecutors. His client was willing to talk, to explain what happened, but wanted a deal. Life in prison with the possibility of parole instead of the death penalty that Texas prosecutors were threatening. The Mitchell family would finally learn what happened to their daughter. After weeks of negotiation, a deal was reached. Rowland would plead guilty to kidnapping and provide full details about Sarah's disappearance and location. In exchange, he would receive life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He would be 87 years old before he could even be considered for release. The interrogation was scheduled for a Monday morning in November. Maria sat across from Rowland again, this time with prosecutors, FBI agents, and his attorney present. A video recorder captured every word. The Mitchell family listened from Oak Ridge via speakerphone, gathered in their living room with a victim advocate. "Tell us about Sarah Mitchell," Maria said, her voice steady despite the rage she felt. Rowland looked older than his 57 years. The weeks since his arrest had aged him. He stared at his hands, weathered from years of construction work, hands that had touched that gate, that had taken a child. "I was working on a roof on Maple Street," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was hot. We took breaks. I drove around the neighborhood during lunch, just looking around, cooling off in the air conditioning." He paused, gathering himself. Maria waited, letting the silence pressure him. "I saw her playing, drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. She had yellow ribbons in her hair. I drove by a few times over 2 days. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I don't know why. Something was wrong with me. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop thinking about it." The room was silent except for his voice and the hum of the recorder. From the speakerphone came the sound of Linda Mitchell crying. "What happened on June 9? Maria asked. "I drove by again during lunch. She was alone. I'd watched the previous day, knew her mother went inside sometimes. The gate was open. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just stopped the car and got out. I called to her, told her I'd lost my dog, asked if she'd seen it. She was sweet, wanted to help. She walked toward me." Rowland's voice cracked. He wiped his eyes. "When she got close, I grabbed her, put my hand over her mouth, picked her up and put her in the car. She tried to scream but couldn't. I drove away. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. No one saw, no one stopped me." Maria's jaw clenched. She forced herself to remain calm, professional. She needed all the information. Where did you take her? My apartment in Austin. I had a one-bedroom place off Highway 290. I kept her in the bedroom. I locked the door. She cried for her mother. She asked when she could go home. I told her soon, but I was lying. I didn't know what to do. He stopped, his hands shaking. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. How long did you keep her there? Maria asked. 3 days. She cried constantly, barely ate. I couldn't take her out, couldn't let her go, couldn't keep her. On the third day, on June 12, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live with what I'd done. The room waited. Everyone knew what was coming but needed to hear it. I drove her out to the woods near Bastrop. There's a state park there, trails, camping areas. I went off the main road, found a remote spot, a clearing near a creek. There was an old oak tree with a split trunk. I told her we were going on a walk, that I'd take her home after. Roland was crying now, tears running down his face. Maria felt no sympathy. What happened in the woods? She asked. I couldn't do it at first. She was holding my hand, trusting me. We walked to the clearing. She asked if we'd see deer. I told her maybe. Then I used my hands. It was quick. She didn't suffer much. I buried her there in a shallow grave, covered her with leaves and branches. Then I drove back to Austin and went to work the next day like nothing happened. The speakerphone erupted with sounds of anguish from the Mitchell home. The victim advocate could be heard comforting them. Maria sat still, processing what she just heard. After 16 years of searching, of hopping against hope that Sarah might somehow be alive, the truth was finally known. You need to take us to the exact location, Maria said. I will, Roland whispered. I'll show you. Recovery teams were assembled. Roland was transported to Bastrop County under heavy guard. Media helicopters followed the convoy. The nation watched as the resolution to a 16-year-old mystery unfolded in the Texas woods. Roland directed them to a remote area of Bastrop State Park, a section rarely visited by hikers. They parked at a service road and walked into the forest. Roland moved slowly, looking for landmarks he hadn't seen in 16 years. After 20 minutes, he stopped at a clearing near a creek. An old oak tree with a split trunk stood at the edge. Here, he said, this is where I buried her. Forensic anthropologists marked off the area. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, scanning the soil for disturbances consistent with a burial site from years earlier. The radar showed anomalies in the exact spot Roland had indicated. The excavation began the next morning. Maria was there, needing to see this through to the end. Forensic teams worked carefully, removing soil layer by layer, documenting everything. News cameras filmed from a distance, respecting the investigation while capturing history. After hours of careful work, they found fabric, yellow fabric with white flowers preserved in the acidic Texas soil. The team worked more carefully now, using brushes and small tools. They uncovered small bones, a child's skeleton, remarkably preserved. A white hair ribbon still clung to strands of brown hair. Maria turned away, tears streaming down her face. She had solved the case. She had found Sarah, but there was no victory in this, no satisfaction. A child was dead. A family's worst fears were confirmed. Justice had come far too late. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Sarah Mitchell. After 16 years, she was coming home. The funeral was held on a Saturday in December 2009, 16 years after Sarah had been taken. Oak Ridge shut down. Every store, every business closed. The entire town gathered at St. Mary's Church, where the Mitchell family had attended for decades, where they had prayed every Sunday for Sarah's return. The church was filled beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, sat on the floor, gathered outside. Yellow ribbons adorned every pew. Sarah's casket was white, covered in yellow roses. Her photograph sat beside it, 7 years old forever, frozen in time with her bright smile and pigtails. Linda and David sat in the front pew, holding each other. Marcus, now 27 years old and a teacher, sat beside them with his wife. The daughter they'd lost had shaped all their lives, had defined their family even in her absence. The service was simple but profound. The pastor spoke of a child taken too soon, of a family's enduring faith, of a community that never forgot. He spoke of justice finally served, of closure that came at tremendous cost, of healing that would take years more. Marcus delivered the eulogy. His voice broke as he spoke of the sister he barely remembered but had never stopped loving. He described the bedroom kept unchanged for 16 years, the birthday cakes with candles lit for someone who wasn't there, the Christmases celebrated with an empty chair at the table. Sarah was 7 years old when she was taken, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. I was 11. I'm 27 now. I've lived more years without her than I did with her, but not a day has passed that I haven't thought about her, haven't wondered what she'd be like, what we'd talk about, who she'd have become. He paused, composing himself. She'd be 23 now. Maybe she'd be a teacher like me. Maybe an artist she loved drawing with those chalk colors on our sidewalk. Maybe a mother herself. We'll never know. That was stolen from her, from us, from everyone who loved her. The congregation wept openly. The loss felt fresh despite 16 years having passed. The finality was crushing. Detective Maria Gonzalez stood with other officers in full dress uniform at the back of the church. She had solved the case, but felt no pride. She had failed to find Sarah while she was alive. That failure would stay with her forever. After the funeral, Sarah was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery under a large oak tree. Her headstone was simple white marble with an angel carved above her name. It read, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, April 15, 1986 to June 12, 1993, forever 7, forever loved. James Rowland's formal sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country attended. The Mitchell family sat in the front row, facing the man who had destroyed their lives. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Linda Mitchell stood. She had prepared remarks but set them aside, speaking from her heart instead. You didn't just take my daughter, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. You took my family's future. You took my son's childhood. You took 16 years of not knowing, of hopping, of breaking apart slowly. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday, we wondered if she was alive, if she was suffering, if she'd ever come home. She stepped closer to Rowland, who sat with his head down. You gave us 3 days with her after you took her. 3 days when we were searching, when the whole town was looking, when she was still alive just an hour away. 3 days when you could have brought her back, could have let her go, could have stopped what you'd started. But you didn't. You killed her and buried her and went to work like nothing happened. Linda's voice rose, anger breaking through grief. I hope you live a long life in prison. I hope every day feels like a year. I hope you never know peace, never know comfort, never know anything but regret for what you did to my baby girl. She returned to her seat. David held her. The judge pronounced sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. Rowland would be 87 years old before he could even be considered for release. As Rowland was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the Mitchell family one last time. Whether seeking forgiveness or simply acknowledging what he'd done, no one could say. The family didn't look at him. He was led out of the courtroom and taken to a maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. The case that had haunted Oak Ridge for 16 years was closed. The file that Detective Maria Gonzalez had kept on her desk, reviewed countless times, studied on weekends and late nights, was finally marked solved and placed in the archives. But solving the case didn't heal the wounds. The Mitchell family would carry their loss forever. Marcus would grow older knowing his sister never would. Linda and David would visit that cemetery plot under the oak tree, bringing yellow flowers, mourning not just the child they lost, but all the years they'd never have with her. The town of Oak Ridge changed. Parents held their children closer. The innocence of that small Texas town, where kids played freely and neighbors trusted each other, never fully returned. Sarah's case became a reminder that danger could come from anywhere, could wear an ordinary face, could hide in plain sight for 16 years. Detective Maria Gonzalez retired 6 months after the case closed. At her retirement party at the Oak Ridge Police Department, Linda and David Mitchell attended. They brought a gift, a framed photograph of Sarah in her yellow sundress, smiling at the camera, forever 7 years old. "Thank you for never forgetting our little girl," Linda said, embracing the detective who had become like family over 16 years of phone calls and updates and shared grief. Maria held the photograph close, tears in her eyes. "I never could," she whispered. "I never will." The photograph hung in Maria's home office for the rest of her life. Sometimes she would look at it and think about the case, about the little girl who drew chalk butterflies on a sidewalk, about the mother who looked away for just 5 minutes, about the 16 years of questions finally answered. Sarah Mitchell's grave in Oak Ridge Cemetery remains a place of remembrance. Visitors still leave yellow ribbons, flowers, stuffed animals, chalk drawings. The angel on her headstone watches over a small plot of earth that holds a child taken too soon and found too late. The arrest had shocked the community not because James Rowland was well known, but because he was invisible. A maintenance worker, a quiet man who kept to himself, someone who blended into the background. He'd lived among them, worked in their town, passed by their children, and hidden his monstrous secret for 16 years. It reminded everyone that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears an ordinary face, drives an ordinary car, carries a toolbox, and destroys lives in the space of 30 seconds on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when a mother answers a phone call and a child is playing alone in a front yard. But the case also reminded them that some people never stop searching, never stop fighting for answers, never stop caring about the victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Detective Maria Gonzalez had devoted 16 years to finding Sarah, had never filed the case away, had never moved on to newer investigations without keeping that yellow-ribboned girl in her thoughts. Justice came slowly, but it came. Technology that didn't exist in 1993 made it possible. Genetic genealogy, improved DNA testing, databases that could connect evidence to suspects across decades. Without these advances, James Rowland might have lived out his life never answering for what he'd done. The Mitchell family continues to live in Oak Ridge. They couldn't leave the town where Sarah spent her 7 years, where her memory lives in the neighbors who searched for her, the church that prayed for her, the cemetery where she finally rests. They've learned to live with the loss, though it never gets easier, never fades, never stops hurting. Every June 9, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, the town holds a memorial. People gather at the park, light candles, share memories. Linda and David attend every year, accepting embraces from neighbors who have become family through shared grief. They speak about Sarah, keeping her memory alive, ensuring that she's remembered as more than a victim, more than a tragedy. She was a girl who loved chalk and yellow ribbons, who wanted to help find a lost dog, who trusted a stranger who betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The case file remains in the Oak Ridge Police Department archives, a thick folder documenting 16 years of investigation, thousands of man-hours, hundreds of interviews, evidence carefully preserved until technology could unlock its secrets. It serves as a teaching tool for new detectives, a reminder to never give up on cold cases, to preserve evidence carefully, to believe that someday, somehow, answers will come. James Rowland sits in a Texas prison, serving his sentence in isolation for his own protection. Other inmates don't look kindly on those who hurt children. He's eligible for parole in 2039, when he'll be 87 years old. The Mitchell family has vowed to attend every parole hearing, to ensure he never walks free, to remind the parole board of the 7-year-old girl whose life he took and the family he destroyed. Sarah Mitchell's story is one of loss and justice delayed but not denied. It's a reminder of the fragility of safety, the persistence of those who seek truth, and the enduring power of a community that refuses to forget. In small towns across America, there are cold cases waiting to be solved, families waiting for answers, victims waiting for justice. Sarah's case proves that time doesn't erase guilt, that technology can bridge decades, and that some people will never stop searching until the truth is found. The yellow ribbons that still appear at Sarah's grave, faded by sun and rain but regularly replaced by those who remember, symbolize hope that never died even when the worst was confirmed. They represent a town's love for a child they couldn't save but would never forget. They mark the resting place of a girl who should have grown up in Oak Ridge, who should have graduated from the local high school, who should have lived a full life, but instead became a symbol of innocence lost and justice finally, painfully, achingly served.